For our guests, for the beginning of the talk, our guest speaker's microphone will be the only one enabled. If you have questions for the speaker, please email them to Mallory at CMC, that's CMC at sandia.gov. CMC is for Cooperative Monitoring Center, and she'll try and gather the questions and lump them together for the Q&A session. If the Zoom meeting fails or you can't hear the speaker, please exit the meeting and re-log in. Our apologies in advance for any technical challenges. And fourth, this is an unclassified event. Please keep any submitted questions unclassified. And now let me tell you a little bit about the CMC and then introduce our speaker. First, I want to highlight that we've improved our online skill events, losing Mallory accepted. And so we've gotten more ambitious. We had for our first event 100 participants, and we've moved to a flat platform that allows more, and so we're already at double that. We tested it all last week and found no issues, so I'm hopeful present situation accepted. And at the risk of forgetting someone, let me start by thanking Mallory Stewart, who was kicking us off, Amir Mahogany, Sarah Calcutt, and Sharon DeLand for setting this up, and our communications experts, Alan Runyon-Beebe and Julie Hall. The National Security Speaker Series is one of Sandia's flagship educational opportunities. The series hosts speakers from government, industry, the military, and academia to help broaden our understanding of national security drivers and emerging issues. We want to thank again the National Security Speaker Series team for continuing to provide outstanding engagements. And my team at the Cooperative Monitoring Center is honored to again co-host this event with you in celebration of the CMC's 25th anniversary. Dedicated in 1994, the CMC was part of Sandia's effort to engender cooperation with the international nuclear security community. The CMC was created to demonstrate how technological collaboration can build trust, and it provided a forum where leaders from around the world could explore scientific solutions to security problems. One of the CMC's earliest successes involved fostering collaboration between Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority to address sensitive shared water security issues. The CMC was able to work with these not-so-friendly neighbors to install water quality monitoring systems at mutually agreed locations along the Jordan River. The data was received by all the regional partners, which included periodic joint analysis and reporting. This action addressed a significant water security problem that impacted millions of people and promoted a culture of scientific cooperation. The CMC was also instrumental in helping to establish trust between engineers and scientists in the US and the former Soviet Union, as those two groups worked toward reducing nuclear dangers as part of the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. This program went on to decrease nuclear threats in India and Pakistan as well. For more than 25 years, the CMC has hosted key policy and decision makers from the US and around the world to promote peace and security through science diplomacy. And our success has not gone unnoticed. The CMC model has been replicated at parallel centers of excellence in Japan, South Korea, Pakistan, and the Middle East. Again, we celebrate the people of the CMC who apply cutting-edge science, engineering, and technology to strengthen international security, and we rededicate the CMC to its mission of science-driven collaboration for international peace and security in the 21st century. Given our mission and vision, it is fitting that we continue to try new technologies and new platforms for important events like this one. Now I'd like to introduce Rose Gottemoeller to share her thoughts on the value of international scientific cooperation in her talk entitled From the Russell-Einstein Manifesto to Beyond New Start. Rose is presently the Payne Distinguished Lecturer at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. She previously served as Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019, Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security from 2012 to 2016, and Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance from 2009 to 2014 at the US State Department. While in the latter role, she was the chief negotiator for the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START. She also held senior positions at the Department of Energy, Deputy Undersecretary of Energy for Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation, and Assistant Secretary for Nonproliferation and National Security. At DOE, Rose was responsible for all nonproliferation cooperation with Russia and the newly independent states. Prior to her work at DOE, she served 3 years as Deputy Director for the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London. She is fluent in Russian and from 1993 to 1994 served on the National Security Council at the White House as Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasian Affairs, with responsibility for denuclearization in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Originally from Ohio, Rose received her BS from Georgetown University and an MA from George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Please welcome our distinguished guest, Rose Gottemoeller. Rose.
Very much, Dave, and it's my great honor to be here and to help you to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Cooperative Monitoring Center, which I have enjoyed working with and benefited from working with over the years of my career. I will warn everyone that I have had some trouble with unstable internet as well, so if you lose me, I will be right back in. But I wanted to talk today about the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, because to me, it is one of the founding documents for science diplomacy and something I know that Sandia CMC has excelled in over the years. So let me begin with a quote from that document. "We shall try to say no single word which should appeal to one group rather than to another. All equally are in peril, and if the peril is understood, there is hope that they may collectively avert it." These words from the Russell-Einstein Manifesto were published in July 1955, and therefore this month, the manifesto is celebrating its 65th year. It was one of the first explicit calls for nuclear disarmament. In 2005, at the time of its 50th anniversary, I participated in a book project to celebrate. Organized by the Pugwash movement, whose organization was spurred by the manifesto, the book was entitled Addressing the Nuclear Weapons Threat, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto 50 Years On. If you'd like to check it out, it's on the web. I just read through it again yesterday. Pugwash Occasional Papers, Volume 4, Number 1, December of 2005. The issues then were much different than they are today. In the wake of 9/11, my essay was focused on the threat of nuclear terrorism, and I countered the arguments of those who wanted to use low-yield weapons to go after bunkers where nuclear terrorists were hiding out. The issues were much different, but the arguments were scarily similar to today's. We have no other way to deal with this threat than with low-yield nuclear weapons. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the manifesto as the starting gun on a long period of science diplomacy that laid the foundations for our successful record of nuclear diplomacy. The Pugwash movement was the first, joined by the Dartmouth Process and the Committee on International Security and Arms Control of the National Academy of Sciences, and others. These are eminent examples of venues where scientists have gotten together, first with their Soviet counterparts, later with Russians, Chinese, Indians, and others, to talk about how to limit and control nuclear weapons. Sandia and its Cooperative Monitoring Center have played an important role in these discussions over the years, providing strong scientific and engineering knowledge, especially on monitoring and verification of constraints on nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. On the occasion of your 25th anniversary, I am truly honored to be able to speak with you today. My essential point is this: science diplomacy is rooted in unparalleled scientific and technical expertise, but that is not enough. There must be an interdisciplinary angle too. Bertrand Russell was the most prominent philosopher of his age, and he teamed up with Albert Einstein, among the most prominent physicists of his age, to create the manifesto. Multiple scientific disciplines must be part of the mix too. If you read through the list of Manifesto signatories, they include a chemist and zoologist in addition to physicists. Today, I would like to talk with you about examples where I have seen science diplomacy at work, and always from the angle of one who is not a scientist, but a policy expert, and in later years, a diplomat. Always, always, success was gained in an interdisciplinary setting. My first example is the threat reduction programs of the 1990s and early 2000s, which Dave already addressed, when we were able to work with the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and others in the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union to ensure that weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, as well as nuclear, left over from the Soviet arsenal did not get into the wrong hands. I will never forget the occasion in 1993 when I was a newly minted political appointee for President Clinton, and Sig Hecker came to my office in the old executive office building to tell me about work that had already begun with former Soviet weapons scientists to figure out how to ensure that fissile materials did not get into the wrong hands. Some of you may have been along with Sig on that occasion. It certainly drained the blood from my face. We had to get moving, and fast. Luckily, we had excellent support from Senators Nunn and Lugar on Capitol Hill and from Congressman Les Aspin, who was soon to become Secretary of Defense. Once Aspin finished his tenure, Bill Perry took over as Defense Secretary with the same focus and determination to ensure that the breakup of the Soviet arsenal would not result in a black market free-for-all, with weapons components and materials being sold to the highest bidder. Before too long, we had a firmer source of funding from the from the DOD and later from the DOE, and were able to do much to secure former facilities. From the BW production plant at Stepnogorsk in Kazakhstan, to the plutonium storage sites in the Urals, to naval nuclear weapons facilities in the Northern Fleet. The projects were urgent and many, and the United States Nuclear Lab stepped forward to make a huge contribution. I am forever grateful again to the CMC at Sandia for putting so many resources into the effort, especially your peerless expertise. But you could not have done it alone. Just consider the team that succeeded in covertly removing more than a half-ton of weapons-grade uranium from Kazakhstan in 1994. It is difficult to fathom that Project Sapphire took place over 25 years ago, but it was a great success. There were several recent histories, including one from the National Security Archives, and they are worth reading if you're not familiar with Project Sapphire. Multiple labs were involved, including the fissile material experts from Oak Ridge and many from Sandia. I also remember the many angles on interdisciplinary in that project. The politicians had to be involved too, because the Clinton White House wanted to bring the material to Tennessee. I will never forget a successful phone call that Vice President Gore made to the governor to convince him. Both of them being Tennessee men, they made good sense to each other. Diplomats had to be involved to get the agreement of the Russian Federation to remove what the Russians may have considered their property, and to work through every legal angle with the Kazakh government. The Defense Department had to be involved because military transport planes were required to move the stuff. In the end of the day, I chaired a Tiger team at the old executive office building to ensure that everybody in the interagency was doing what they needed to do on a day in, day out basis. That was when I first became fully aware of the importance of the Department of Energy to US nuclear diplomacy and the labs along with it. Let's now turn to another example of interdisciplinary, and that is the delegation that negotiated the New START Treaty in 2009 and 2010. It was a large group with representatives from across the US interagency, more than 70 people from the Departments of State, Energy and Defense, the intelligence community, and the laboratories. We needed not only diplomats, but also people who had been weapon system operators and inspectors on previous nuclear arms control treaties, especially START. In fact, their expertise was crucial to being able to move quickly in the New START negotiations. They also proved to be natural diplomats who could speak the right technical language to their Russian counterparts and quickly gain their understanding of what we were trying to accomplish, or fairly quickly anyway. Some issues were slow and frustrating, but that's just the way that negotiations go. Anyway, I always say that if it were not for our inspectors and weapon system operators, we would not have gotten New START done in a single year, by comparison with START, which took over 6 years on and off to complete. Our interdisciplinary team also included a number of people from the labs, and they brought special knowledge and understanding to some of the key issues that had to be resolved before we could get to yes with the Russians. Telemetry is probably the most important example. Kurt Seaman, whom many of you know, was the senior DOE representative to the negotiations, and I was very glad to have him on the team. Kurt and I had served together on the START delegation in 1990 and 1991, when he was still in uniform, and I was a very green and very junior advisor from the Department of State. I always say that Kurt knows everything there is to know about how to negotiate with the Russians, and he was my first tutor. His experience was crucial to the success 20 years later of the New START negotiations. He always was clear that he needed technical expertise to get what he needed at the negotiating table, and so brought lab experts to Geneva to work with him on the telemetry problem. I'm so grateful for the contribution that they made, because telemetry data was not needed in New START the same way that it was needed in START to confirm the counting rule for warheads on delivery vehicles. It was, however, a crucial political requirement for the success of the New START ratification process. So that tells you something you already know. Sometimes science, technology, and politics become inextricably linked, or maybe not sometimes, but actually many times. One final thing I'd like to say before I leave this topic. Negotiating a nuclear arms control treaty cannot be done on a drive-by basis. A 2-day visit to Geneva or to Vienna is not going to do it. You need sustained effort over a long period of time, and you need a dedicated delegation that stays in place to keep up that effort. As Jim Timby has said, and many of you know Jim Timby from his long career at the State Department, he said recently, arms agreements are the result of hard work by people on a mission. The New START delegation was certainly on a mission, and I am forever grateful to those listening today who were on that delegation. I will turn finally to science diplomacy as I know it today, as a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on International Security and Arms Control. This committee has been in existence since 1983. I am sure that many of you have interacted with it over the years. I have really been honored to serve on it when not in government with great scientists such as Pete Panofsky and Dick Garwin. Today I am there with Jill Hruby, former director of Sandia, and it's a great pleasure as well as an honor to be working with Jill. There has been a fundamental change this year in science diplomacy as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is the advent of virtual meetings. We have all experienced them. We are indeed experiencing one right now. I think such virtual meetings will be a future determinant of the success of science diplomacy. For interactions with our Russian counterparts, there has been a special advantage to going virtual, and that is the frequency of meetings. We have been accustomed over the years to meeting once or twice a year in Moscow or Washington, or perhaps third locations. Intersessional work took place, but always hampered by communications problems, even after email came into existence. Now we have weekly Zoom meetings and are able to develop work from one session to the next. We will see how long we can keep this up. Everyone is suffering from Zoom fatigue. I'm sure many on this call are as well. But I have found it to be an advantage during this period of great ferment when we are considering the future of nuclear arms control. Will New START be extended? Will we be able to begin a new negotiation on nuclear arms reductions? Will we be able to get China to the table? What kind of new systems and subjects should be part of the equation? We have been talking about all of these topics with more or less focus since April. The most surprising thing that we have gotten from the Russians is that they are willing to consider limits on nuclear warheads, including NSNW, non-strategic nuclear warheads. As many of you know, this has been the holy grail for nuclear arms control for a long time. We have controlled warheads through their association with delivery vehicles. Once the delivery vehicles were destroyed and the warheads were off them, they were no longer considered to be a threat. Trying to control nuclear warheads directly was always too sensitive because to verify the process would require monitoring in very sensitive nuclear weapons facilities. But you all know this. Both we and the Russians were not keen to go down that road, but knew that one day we would have to face the issues as we tackled ever more ambitious goals at the negotiating table. Now we are looking to constrain ability to upload nuclear warheads on delivery vehicles, and also getting a better handle on weapon systems designed for dual capability, both nuclear and conventional. These are ambitious goals, and they will require us to tackle the problem of nuclear warhead limits and controls and monitoring more directly. I'm glad that both we and the Russians seem willing, at least in the CSAC group, to look at the issue and consider how we might go about monitoring and verifying constraints directly on warheads. Jill Ruby has been taking the lead in the discussions, which is very welcome. We will see where the discussions go. It is unpredictable right now. I also hasten to add that on both sides, we are not representing our governments, although we are both knowledgeable about what our governments are doing and are briefing our government officials. That is the essence of science diplomacy conducted on the second track. That is, that we can offer our best advice informed by what we hear from our foreign counterparts. Whether governments take that advice, of course, is not up to us, but we hope to be as useful as we can to the official processes. I will say once again, however, that what produces effective policy in or out of government is an interdisciplinary approach. In that respect, I look forward to working with all of you going forward. Let me end with a point I made at the end of my 2005 essay, when we were still grappling with the immediacy of the 9/11 attacks. I argued at the time that we must continue to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons and fissile material, or, and here I quote from my essay, we will at some time and some place we cannot predict, succumb to nuclear terror. I went on to say that Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein made this point beautifully at the close of their manifesto, although they were warning against the threat of an all-out nuclear war. They said, there lies before us, if we choose, continual progress in happiness, knowledge, and wisdom. Shall we instead choose death because we cannot forget our quarrels? We appeal as human beings to human beings. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. Food for thought in closing. I endorse the manifesto. It's worth reading on its 65th anniversary. And I look forward to our discussion today, your comments and your questions. Thank you very much.
Sorry for my departure early on. That was an excellent speech and very much appreciated, Rose, that you touched on all those topics. We've had a flood of questions coming in. So I'll give you a moment to catch your breath and then start asking these questions. And to our online audience, remember you can still submit more questions to cmc@sandia.gov. And I've aggregated some of the similar questions, so I'll try to ask as many as I can in the next few minutes. So first, I wanted to ask a question that we've seen a couple times, which is, what do you feel is the role of the labs in the current and the future arms control and non-proliferation environment, given the new strategic competitive elements that we've heard about from various members of the Trump administration and other government officials?
I think, honestly, that the role of the labs can continue as it has, but let me comment on the larger point about greater strategic competitiveness these days. I actually do see it, of course, emerging. The Russians are behaving in that way, and we see it on the Chinese side as a kind of new phenomenon that we haven't experienced before, but it's very real, and we see it every day, whether it's in the South China Sea, or I experienced it as Deputy Secretary General of NATO when the Chinese were very vigorously buying up port facilities in Europe, which gave pause to NATO. If we need to reinforce in Europe with troops and equipment from North America, and the Chinese are owning the port facilities in Europe, is that going to make it harder? Well, I think the answer is yes. So we were very concerned about some of the global reach that China is beginning to exhibit. So I think that these are real phenomena, real factors, and we have to be serious about them and pay attention. but I would like to recollect the success of diplomacy during the Cold War years. During the darkest days of the Cold War, we had some of our greatest success in beginning to constrain and control nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. It did take that short, sharp shock of the Cuban Missile Crisis to get both the Soviet Union and the United States to the negotiating table for some extraordinarily productive work. But again, diplomacy is not a favor to any other country. It is a tool that we use to advance our interests. And so I see no reason why, even in an age of strategic competitiveness, we would not want to use the diplomacy tool to advance our interests and to continue to advance our interests. As that diplomacy produces results, as it is successful, and we hope to see further agreement, I think the lab should be present in helping both to shape those agreements, to give technical answers to difficult problems like non-strategic nuclear warhead monitoring and verification, and then to back up implementation to help to ensure that the implementation of such measures goes forward correctly and smoothly. So that's in general my thinking on this important matter.
Thank you. We have several questions about the desire to include China in the New START extensions or New START renegotiations. China has not shown any interest, short of a treaty. What other options to meaningfully engage China do you think are on the table for a potential future treaty, either bilaterally with China or trilaterally with China and Russia?
Thank you very much. It won't surprise any listeners today that my view is that the New START treaty should be extended for 5 years without preconditions. I do think that this is very squarely in the U.S. national security interest, primarily because we are right at the beginning of our modernization process. The Russians have pretty much completed their nuclear modernization process at this point. They have hot production lines for both missiles and warheads. They also have a good deal of upload capacity, the ability to load additional warheads on their existing missiles. So I believe that if they chose to do so, they could outrun us rather quickly if New START goes away. It's important for us to keep those 700 and 1,500 limits in place. That's 700 delivery vehicles and 1,550 warheads, because it keeps the Russians under control as we begin to modernize our nuclear arsenal. I don't think it makes any sense for us to be trying to chase them at the same time that we are trying to modernize. So that's my basic reason for saying it's in the US national security interest to extend New START and to do so immediately for 5 years, and then to proceed with further negotiations. But I also think that it is important to get China to the negotiating table. It's high time. We were just talking in the first question about the geostrategic reach of China. They too clearly are modernizing their nuclear forces, although they are far behind the United States and Russia in numbers. But it's time for them to begin also to consider the role of negotiated restraint on weapons of mass destruction, and particularly on their nuclear arsenal. So I do believe that that is important. Now the venue, I think, could be several. It's possible. I know up to this point they have repeatedly said that they don't want to join the United States and Russia in the current negotiations, but that could change, I suppose. But the other venue that is already available to us is the so-called P5 venue that I worked on for many years as Undersecretary of State. It was created back in 2010 and has been in existence now for 10 years and involves the so-called nuclear weapon states under the NPT, UK and France, in addition to Russia, the United States, and China. So that's a venue that the Chinese seem rather comfortable in working in. And I frankly believe it's a place where we could begin to introduce them to some of the basic building blocks of a strategic nuclear arms treaty. Already in that P5 setting, we have been working with the Chinese on a glossary of nuclear terms, and setting out basic definitions, as you all know, is one of the most basic building blocks of a nuclear arms treaty. So why not use the P5 to start talking to them about other kinds of building blocks, like how to construct a database. What's the importance of a database? How to construct a notifications regime. What's the importance of a notification regime? And just start to familiarize them with all the parts and pieces of a good strategic nuclear arms treaty.
Great, thank you. We have a couple questions on whether there is a downside, or if you've seen any downside to science diplomacy, and under what conditions, if any, are there restraints or limitations to what science diplomacy can accomplish?
Well, of course, science diplomacy is always subject to the political environment, and succeeds best where the political environment is stable, where goals are shared among the various capitals involved, whether it's Moscow and Washington or other capitals involved as well. So that's clearly where it succeeds best. Where it stalls and where difficulties unfold is when the political environment deteriorates, and I think we've all seen that at various times in our career. But here's where I think the role of the second track, or track 1.5, as we say. Second track, of course, is all non-governmental. Track 1.5 also involves some representatives from governments, at least sitting in as observers. Here's where I think that track 2, science diplomacy, can make an enormous difference. And throughout the 1960s, when we had not yet experienced the full impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis and had not yet gotten to the serious negotiating tables that took shape in the late 1960s with negotiation of the NPT, the CTBT, and then SALT I and the ABM Treaty. This period was one where I think science diplomacy played an enormous role in beginning to lay out concepts, to accustom other countries, the Soviet Union in particular during that period, to accustom them to some of the requirements that would come up in a negotiation and get them thinking about it. So I really think that even when the political environment is very bad, as it was during the Cold War years, second track science diplomacy can continue to play a role. It's difficult to quantify. It's difficult to get your arms around exactly what the contribution is, how big is the contribution, what exactly is accomplished. But nevertheless, I can see from that history that second track science diplomacy can play a good role even in the worst of times.
Thank you. So we have a question from one of your colleagues at Stanford. Is national security becoming an obsolete concept unless it is seen as an integral part of the global security of all nations? Where do you think US national thinking is on these issues? And in this nuclear age, can we just buy national security at the expense of other nations?
Well, I think national security always takes preeminence for any decision-making on security issues in any country, and that definitely goes for the United States. But I do agree with the notion that that national security decision-making can become, first of all, further aware of the global security demands in this day and age. And not only, when I think of existential threats to global security today, they involve not only the threat of nuclear conflagration, but also climate change and potentially some other issues. But those are the big two from my perspective: the nuclear conflagration threat and climate change threat. So I do think that it's important to consider how to house US national security interests in these global concerns that are an existential threat, not only to the United States of America, but to the global community. And so having more of an interplay between those two aspects, I think, are very, very important. And that means raising awareness about global security and about the threats that affect global security. So I welcome that discussion very much. I welcome that discourse very much. I think we need more of it.
And we've had some follow-ups on your discussion of New START in light of the arguments that Russia has been in certain contexts violating existing treaties, not necessarily New START, but other treaties that we were a party to with Russia previously, What benefit is it to the US to continue in treaty relationships with a treaty partner that appears to violate and potentially outpace the US in advancing its systems?
Well, I think 2 points. First of all, it's important to take compliance seriously. And I was the US diplomat who first went to the Russians about their violation of the INF Treaty and worked before I left the Department of State to go to NATO. I worked unceasingly for several years to try to get them to acknowledge the violation and to take seriously US concerns. So I do think it's very important to take compliance seriously and to pay attention when violations are occurring. But I also think you have to look carefully at what treaties are being violated and which are being complied with. And in the case of New START, the Russians are complying with New START. And that's where bigger US interests take, I think, must take the front seat. You have to look at what New START is doing to keep the Russians constrained, to keep them, as the questioner asked, from outpacing the United States. New START is playing that role by keeping Russian numbers down and also by ensuring that some of the new technologies that they are already beginning to deploy are brought into the treaty. The Russians have already indicated that they are willing to bring 3 of the 5 systems that are the so-called exotic nuclear systems that Putin announced in 2018. They've already said they're willing to bring 3 of the 5 of them under the New START treaty, the Sarmat heavy ICBM, the Avant-Garde HGV, the hypersonic glide vehicle, and the Kinjal, the air-launched ballistic missile. So I think in that case, we see a possibility not only to continue the constraints of New START, but to begin constraining these new systems. And that, I think, is an important factor also to bear in mind. And by the way, with a 700 delivery vehicle limit, the Russians are going to have to make some very, very tough choices about how many of those new systems to deploy. How many of the new Sarmat heavy ICBMs are they going to deploy if they have to give up their modern, very effective, and accurate mobile ICBMs that they've been deploying as part of their modernization program. So they'll have to make some tough trade-offs and consider how many they'll be willing to trade off with the heavy ICBM, how many mobile ICBMs they'll be willing to trade off with the Sarmat heavy ICBM. So I think New START forces some important choices on the Russians as well, but the key thing is it keeps them sharply limited.
Thank you. That's really helpful to a lot of the questions we've received. Another sort of group of questions focuses on different perspectives and even relationship building in the science diplomacy context and in diplomacy writ large. And I'll start with this question on whether your experience at NATO changed your thinking or perspective on any of the national and international security issues. And if so, how has your perspective changed?
I was on a steep learning curve at NATO. Many of you know that I've spent most of my career working on bilateral issues with the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation, many of them related to the Soviet-Russian nuclear forces and limitations and constraints, and then laterally the cooperative threat reduction program and ensuring that the breakup of the Soviet Union did not result in this free-for-all I talked about in my remarks with former Soviet nuclear components and fissile material getting into the black market and potentially into terrorist hands. So those were issues that consumed me for much of my career. And when I got to NATO, all of a sudden I was in a multilateral venue with, at the time, 28 allies. While I was there, the 29th ally, Montenegro, joined. And just as I was departing, the 30th ally, the Republic of North Macedonia, joined, these were very, very, well, for me, wonderful moments. They made me very proud of the vigor and the adaptability of the NATO alliance. But I was on a steep learning curve, learning how to address the concerns and deal with 29 different allies, learning how to preserve consensus when many different views could be possible around the table and when many different disagreements could go on. I had to learn a lot about the politics as well as the security interests of the individual countries. So I would say in general, it was for me a steep learning curve, a great learning experience. And I'm glad at my age that I was on that steep learning curve, because if you're not learning something new every day, you might as well hang it all up. So NATO was a great experience for me. I feel I was able to make some contribution there, and I really enjoyed my 3 years there. But I am glad to be back, and glad to be back working with good colleagues at Stanford on issues to do with nuclear security, non-proliferation, and arms control.
And then sort of a follow-up to that one. There are always missed opportunities and some opportunities that come very close to realization, both in diplomatic relationships, in accomplishments, and in treaties. Is there a significant, quote, almost realized missed opportunity that you had during your time at the State Department or during your time at NATO that you think is still on the horizon?
Well, I will say that I was very disappointed. As we negotiated with the Russians the New START treaty, we made it clear to them that President Obama was keen to proceed with additional nuclear reductions during his time in office. And indeed, in 2013 in Berlin, President Obama offered an up to 1/3 further reduction in strategic warheads, operationally deployed warheads. And that was, I thought, a very important offer. It was the Russians at the time who were unwilling to join in any further negotiations. First of all, they said that New START had to be fully implemented first. That is, the central limits of the treaty would have to be reached, and that would only happen in February of 2018 after President Obama left office. So very early on, they signaled they had no interest in reaching an additional deal with President Obama. I thought that that was a significant mistake on their part, but nothing I could say would convince them of anything other. And then with their invasion of Crimea, of course, we shut down a lot of our diplomacy with the Russians. In fact, most of it. We did keep nuclear diplomacy going and worked with them very hard to ensure that New START continued to be implemented and completely implemented in a proper way. But I do say that to me was, it seems so close, and we're back there again, you know, that we want to deploy, or rather begin further negotiations for reductions. But I think we could have accomplished it a lot faster if the Russians had been willing to do so. But that's the way it goes in diplomacy. You have to have two to tango, is the old cliche, and it makes sense in a nuclear arms reduction as in any other field. So that was a missed opportunity from my perspective.
Thank you. Just a few more questions before we have to give it over to Dave again to thank you for all of your great answers. And I'll try to fit in just a few more. This one is about the IAEA, but more broadly, I think about international agreements in general. The question relates to the IAEA's inspection capacity, nation sanctioning and embargoes capacity, and other de-incentivizing efforts for preventing non-nuclear states from pursuing nuclear weapons. What, in your mind and in your experience, do you find are the teeth of international agreements? What really seems to be effective in preventing the states from pursuing these dangerous weapons?
Well, again, I think the primary interest of states who have not pursued these kinds of nuclear weapons programs, it's a combination of having security arrangements that provide them certain guarantees, as the United States provides certain guarantees to our NATO allies as well as to our allies in Asia. It's a combination of having security arrangements that they are comfortable with, that they don't need nuclear weapons for their security, and see the negative downside of pursuing nuclear weapons. And often those negative downsides are associated not only with nuclear threats that may ensue to them, but also with the expense, the resources required to maintain a nuclear weapons program. And that, as we all know, and that the labs know better than most, that it's not only the front end of producing the nuclear weapons, but also the back end dealing with the materials left over from their production and addressing cleanup issues. Very, very expensive. And I think many states breathed a sigh of relief when the Non-Proliferation Treaty came in to force, because they no longer perhaps felt that they had to pursue, as they agreed to be non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT, they no longer felt they had to pursue nuclear weapons programs. And it's interesting when I look back at that history that there were so many states in Europe pursuing nuclear weapons programs. States as diverse as Switzerland and Sweden were pursuing nuclear weapons programs, but I think they made decisions to step away from those programs based on a sense that their security could be guaranteed in other ways, number one, and number two, that they just did not want to bear the financial burden of that. So it's, I think, those kinds of basic national calculations that in the end of the day make the biggest difference. But I would say where agreements are involved and international organizations and the IAEA, it also makes sense to keep a sharp eye on what countries are doing and what non-proliferation or proliferation behavior might emerge. And that is why the IAEA safeguards programs over the years have been so important, including the additional protocol that was negotiated after Iraq. It's very, very important to have the additional protocol and you know, steps that the IAEA and tools the IAEA has in hand to keep a sharp eye on the proliferation threat. So I have been impressed over the years, and I think just a word to those of you at the CMC who are thinking about this. Many of you work with the IAEA, I know, but I think a lot of the innovative work that the IAEA has been doing on monitoring, and JCPOA monitoring is one example, but in other areas they've been doing some innovative work on monitoring of nuclear materials. I think this is an area that is not, I think, well known and understood in other settings. And so I think the technical expertise of the IAEA, of course, they, as they say, it's an old term, they tend their knitting. They keep their noses down and keep quietly working on their important agenda. But I do think that they have made some strides in monitoring of nuclear materials. Of course, not in military programs, but nevertheless, it's well worthwhile, I think, to pay more attention perhaps and perhaps advertise a little more broadly the work that the IAEA is doing. And by the way, if there are those of you on this call who disagree with me on bringing IAEA work more out into the light of day, I'd really be interested in hearing about it. So I welcome your being in touch after this session is over.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And just want to remind everyone that this speech will be available on the CMC website in the next few weeks, and that you can watch it and forward it again, because it's been so helpful in answering all of these questions. So the last question I'm going to ask is whether the US response to the invasion of Crimea damaged our reputation for honoring security agreements, and whether some of the actions we've taken recently are challenging our commitment to security agreements in the eyes of the European Union or others. So a little bit more specific, I guess, in this question.
Yes, this question, I believe, refers to the so-called Budapest Memorandum and the commitments that the United States, Russia, and the UK took as signatories of the NPT, and not only as signatories, but repository states of the NPT, to provide security assurances to Ukraine. And the security assurance was that should Ukraine ever feel its security to be threatened, that US, Russia, and UK would be ready to consult with it to resolve try to resolve those issues. Well, I think the Russians actually violated the Budapest Memorandum, and I bring that up time and again. It's not the fault of the Budapest Memorandum that the Russians violated it, but the other point I would make, and people often say, oh, well, the Budapest Memorandum was a political agreement. It wasn't a legally binding agreement. If it had been a legally binding security guarantee, it would have been better for Ukraine. But I want to stress that the Russians violated a number of treaties and agreements legally binding, including their bilateral 1997 agreement with Ukraine on the border demarcation and security arrangements. They violated the UN Charter and their commitments and obligations in that regard. So let's just not focus in on the Budapest Memorandum as a problem here. It's the general Russian violation of the regimes of international law to which they are signatories. And so I think there's a larger set of issues to confront. That said, and I continue to say to the Ukrainians, their security would not have been guaranteed by trying somehow to hang on to the Soviet nuclear weapons and missile systems that were left deployed on their territory. It would have meant a constant, long-running, and unstable situation throughout the years when they were trying to establish their independence. I think Ukraine is still in the midst of difficult situations, obviously, with Russia continuing to operate in the Donbass and the irregulars continuing to operate there, as well as the Russian occupation of Crimea. So there's no question that Ukraine continues to be under pressure from Russia. But at the same time, I would say that Ukrainian independence in these 30 years has taken root to an extraordinary degree. And Ukraine has only to continue to build up its capacity, to build up its capability to fight corruption and to address the issues that are very much present in Ukrainian governance. And they are ready to take their place as a premier European nation. So they've got more work to do, but, and we always said at NATO that the Bucharest commitments from the summit in 2008 stand, that Ukraine wishes to be a member of NATO, and when the time is right, it can be a member of NATO. So at NATO, certainly, we saw Ukraine as a country that was headed in the direction of being a major European power if it can deal with corruption and the other issues affecting its governance. So that's a long answer to the question, but I do feel that the United States has continued in the response to Crimea to be consistent and to be tough. And I think that's very important, that the programs of sanctions that we have put in place against Russia for its invasion of Crimea and our continued insistence on Russian implementation of its commitments to the Minsk process, I think all of those are very, very important and must continue. But the US has been consistent in this regard.
Thank you so much, Rose, for taking the time today to answer these very diverse and wide-ranging questions with such fulsome and really insightful answers.
My pleasure.
We appreciate having you here. I know Dave Sandison has a few closing remarks, but deepest thanks from me.
Thanks, Mallory. Yeah, and Rose, thanks again for sharing your experience and your expertise. Thank you to the audience for great questions on topics that are very long-lasting and at a very timely moment. I was going to say a very timely moment in history, but as I listened to you talk, I realized that there are timely moments like this pretty much all the time. It's really disappointing that we can't have you here in person, where we would shake your hands and have a photo op and get you a CMC and Sandia coin. Well, we won't short you the coins. We'll at least mail those to you for your collection. And so thank you again. And for others on the line, I wanted to let you know that you can learn more about the CMC and our 25 years of history by logging on to sandia.gov. And again, thank you, Rose, Mallory, thank you for moderating. Thank you to all who tuned in. And from all of us at Sandia, have a great day and press forward and look forward to seeing you at future National Security Speaker Series and CMC events. Thank you.